The beginning of the rumors. Every major city has its share of urban legends, but few have captured the collective imagination of New York City quite like the tales surrounding apartment 301 in the towering Riverside Towers. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, as new residents streamed into Manhattan seeking opportunity, buzz began to circulate, barely whispers at first, about one apartment that seemed to repel anyone who tried to make a home there. It began subtly, almost innocently, as so many ghost stories do. Rumors fluttered through the Riverside Towers mailroom amid the clatter of mail slots and the hurried footsteps of residents. Elderly tenants exchanged glances when the topic came up in elevator rides. Some said it started when movers delivering furniture to apartment 301 late one evening refused to finish the job, pale and noticeably shaky, muttering about a cold spot by the doorway and inexplicable shadows flickering across the hallway. A janitor working overtime claimed his mop bucket had rolled several feet on its own, only to tip over just outside 301's door. As the months rolled on, reports stacked up. Young couples, ambitious professionals, and recent immigrants who had recently moved into apartment 301 packed up and left without much explanation, often breaking their leases early. Their neighbors recalled heated arguments punctuated by sudden silences, mysterious drafts sweeping through the hall at midnight, and the faint but persistent melody of an old phonograph playing from within the sealed apartment, though the previous tenants had not owned any such device according to building management records. More disturbing still were the tales from children who, with the uncanny honesty of youth, described invisible friends with odd accents who lived by the third door from the stairs. Parents dismissed these accounts as imagination at first, until a few of them, returning late from errands, heard their child quietly humming tunes no one in the family knew, or chattering to a shadow lingering at the end of the hallway. By the end of the first year, the legend had grown teeth. Residents began leaving small handmade talismans or religious symbols taped furtively around the threshold of 301, hoping to ward off whatever presence was said to dwell inside. Night porters avoided that corner of the floor, and some refused to even clean the immediate vicinity of the apartment after hearing odd knocks or catching glimpses of indistinct figures in the periphery. Local newspapers picked up the thread when an anonymous tip hinted at strange doings in the old tower. Soon, speculation flourished, not just on ghost stories after sundown but in late-night radio shows, barroom conversations in the West Village, and even water cooler chats in Midtown offices. As this patchwork of unease, superstition, and anecdote thickened, Riverside Tower's third floor gained a reputation citywide for being, as some called it, the floor the sun never reaches. Every fresh tenant hoping for an affordable riverside view would hesitate outside 301, heart hammering, keys in hand, aware that regardless of their skepticism, apartment 301 had earned an infamy that would follow them long after they stepped through its door. Strange event chain. The apartment's reputation for the unexplainable started off as background noise, a handful of shared glances, a sense of unease that tickled the backs of necks long before people could put words to it. Yet those who dared to move into the infamous unit on the third floor would soon find themselves tangled in a web of increasingly bizarre occurrences. The peculiar chain of events kicked off with Martha Stewart, a pragmatic widow who openly mocked the notion of ghosts and ghouls. She took up residence in apartment 301 lured by a rent price that seemed too good to be true given its prime Manhattan location. On her very first night, as she closed her eyes against the city's hum, strange noises seeped through her walls, soft weeping one moment, then a low, whispering melody the next. Martha shrugged it off. The building was old, after all. But then her belongings began to act out a story of their own. Keys would vanish from their dish, only to reappear inside the fridge. Picture frames spun half circles on the wall. Her old clock radio, unplugged, would sometimes flip on to play fragments of jazz standards at 2 a.m. Determined not to let superstition win, Martha decided to stay, but her nerves frayed more quickly than she expected. Doors would click open in the dead of night. Shadows crawled over the edges of her vision. Worst of all, icy drafts billowed from behind sealed windows, stealing the apartment's air so sharply it made her breath visible, even in the heart of summer. After 3 weeks, Martha packed up and left in silence, unable to offer anyone a logical explanation. Her departure signaled the start of a disturbing pattern. 3 robust men moved in next, skeptics by nature, their personalities shaped by blue-collar grit. Armed with bravado and beer, they made light of the apartment's reputation. but their bravado melted with each passing night. Their laughter became tense, and eventually they began sleeping with bedroom doors chained shut. They reported waking to the sound of rhythmic tapping on the radiator even though the heating was off for the season. Sometimes they claimed the apartment seemed to shrink, walls leaning inward as if attempting to squeeze out anyone inside. One by one the men left, first Mike, who'd started sleepwalking and twice woken while unlocking the main exit at 3 in the morning. Then Don, who swore he had heard a woman's voice pleading outside the bathroom door. Finally Sam, whose hands shook as he signed the forfeit notice, whispered that he saw his reflection blink independently in the cracked hallway mirror. For some time, apartment 301 sat uninhabited. Its heavy door collected dust, and the air on the third floor grew dense with unease. Neighbors avoided the short stretch of hallway, more out of primal instinct than belief, crossing themselves quietly or tapping the elevator's close button with urgency. But the apartment refused to let memories fade. Every couple of months new tenants would arrive, drawn by the unit's inexplicable affordability. Each brought with them new skepticism, and each one eventually left, pale and startled, clutching bills and lease-mandated deposit slips. The stories became stranger. Lights flickering in cryptic Morse code, the smell of scorched sugar wafting from the kitchen at 101 every morning, and music, always music, threading faintly through the air, a sorrowful tune echoing long after anyone should have been home to play it. The once busy hallway became a static shadow, punctuated only by the distant echo of cautious footfalls and the palpable sting of the supernatural. The pattern, witnessed by dozens, became a certainty. The longer someone stayed in 301, the more reality seemed to shift, making rational explanation impossible. And so the legend of the strange events and the whispers that followed them only grew with each person brave or foolish enough to try their hand at living there. The changing tides. The unsettling presence in apartment 301 at Riverside Towers soon created a kind of silent agreement among most of its residents. People would come and go, rarely lasting more than a few weeks before bolting in the middle of the night, or leaving hurried, apologetic notes to building management. The apartment's reputation became so infamous that real estate agents tasked with filling the vacancy would simply offer apologetic shrugs and price reductions, warning subtly or sometimes not so subtly that 301 was a special case. One by one, tenants from various backgrounds moved into 301, each hoping that perhaps their skepticism or indifference to rumors would shield them from the apparent curse clinging to those faded walls. A hopeful graphic designer named Carla lasted just over 3 weeks before she packed her belongings in the middle of the night, trembling as she called for a taxi, muttering vague excuses about bad energy to the doorman. Then there was the Nguyen family, recent immigrants from Seattle, who thought city living would be a fresh start. But within days they started hearing whispered voices echoing through the vents and doors shutting on their own. The father, a rational software engineer, attempted to ignore it. The mother insisted on burning incense every dusk. But after they all witnessed the same spectral silhouette crossing the kitchen at midnight, they left so abruptly that they didn't bother collecting the lease deposit. Over time, apartment 301's ominous presence seeped deeper into the psyche of the entire third floor. Neighbors living adjacent to the unit grew defensive, avoiding eye contact in the hallway and surreptitiously checking locks twice, sometimes 3 times before bed. A particularly superstitious older woman began using chalk to draw odd symbols along her doorway, whispering prayers as she passed by 301. Even the building's maintenance crew requested to switch their rotation to avoid the bad floor, where their tools had a habit of disappearing, and the lights flickered out just as soon as they started cleaning. With each new failed tenancy, the stories grew. The piano in 301 that played itself at odd hours, the chilling laughter heard in the early mornings, and even tales of a little girl's voice singing old lullabies, despite no one with children ever living there since the late 1980s. Those few brave enough to remain in their neighboring apartments either became numb to the inexplicable or learned a careful, reverent silence whenever the conversation turned to 301. By the 5th year, 301 stood mostly empty, its heavy steel door layered with dust, the mailbox overflowing with discarded flyers for pizza and cable deals. Local legend grew around the vacant unit, and children dared each other to knock on its door late at night, only for the bravest to come running back wide-eyed, swearing they'd heard voices responding from within. In response to mounting complaints and property value concerns, the Buildings Association even attempted a blessing ceremony with incense, scripture, and holy water. But the priest who led the blessing left pale, shaken, and unwilling to return, allegedly saying that something ancient still lingers here. Years went by, and Riverside Towers forgot how many had come and gone from apartment 301. The third floor turned into a quasi-no-man's land, shunned by new tenants and spoken about in hushed tones by longtime residents. The continual turnover only served to deepen the aura surrounding the unit, so much so that even realtors eventually stopped trying to rent it, citing irreconcilable maintenance issues in official listings. For those who still lived nearby, the words apartment 301 evoked a mixture of curiosity, trepidation, and a secret hope never to be assigned there, as if to tempt fate by even approaching that haunted threshold. Haunting Sounds Night in any bustling city holds its own set of mysteries. But in the case of Riverside Tower's third floor, the sounds that echoed through the halls became more than just background noise. They became a legend of their own. Residents of the building, especially those in the immediate vicinity of apartment 301, spoke in hushed voices about the unusual cacophony that seemed to come alive after midnight. It started off as faint, unexplained footsteps, the click-clack of heels moving at a measured pace along the linoleum corridor. Sometimes the echoes stopped abruptly at someone's door, vanishing into silence, leaving the sense that whoever or whatever was making those sounds was pausing to listen or stare. But these footsteps were the least of it. On clouded, restless nights, air vents would carry a muffled hum, almost like radio static, but if you stood close and listened hard, the noise resolved into voices. Most often it was just soft, unintelligible murmurs, but sometimes clear words emerged, laughter tinged with something sorrowful, or the sharp hiss of two young women arguing in a language modern tenants couldn't quite place. More than one night, Owl described hearing the echo of a piano or old record playing a waltz, reverberating behind the sealed, empty door of 301, only to cut off when approached as if someone inside was aware of the curiosity outside. The more superstitious tenants believed the third floor was a kind of amplifier for sorrow. They said if you pressed your ear to the apartment's frame, you might hear the soft sobs of a girl, or the frantic whispering of siblings plotting something in fear. Cold spots would drift up and down the hall in synchrony with these sounds, causing electric shivers to race up spines and forcing even the bravest souls back to their own units long before dawn. One of the most chilling happenings was the frequent slamming, or sudden creaking, of apartment 301's door. Even after the unit was sealed up, neighbors reported hearing it open and shut in the dead of night, sometimes accompanied by giggles or a melody drifting just long enough to disrupt sleep. Children whispered about seeing shadows shift beneath the door, flickering in time with the rhythm of muffled music. Some residents attempted to record the noises with their phones, hoping to capture evidence. Strangely, the recordings always seemed to become corrupted, ending in a staticky mess just as the haunting sounds reached their peak. This only fueled the mystery, and before long, the third floor's nightly symphony became the subject of late-night discussions and urban legends far beyond Riverside Towers itself. Family tragedy. The story of apartment 301 was forever changed by a tragedy that would ripple through the building for decades. In the early 1980s, the unit became home to Janice Miller and her two daughters, Emily and Hannah. Janice had moved to New York after her husband's sudden passing, hoping to find fresh beginnings and a sense of community in the bustling heart of Manhattan. Raising her daughters alone, Janice poured herself into long shifts as a school custodian while her oldest, Emily, took on part-time administrative work and helped her mother in any way possible. Hannah, meanwhile, was still in high school, quietly excelling despite their upheaval. The family was close-knit. They shared dinners, movie nights, and whispered dreams for the future, even as the rhythms of city life imposed a hurried pace. Emily, intelligent and warm, had begun dating Lucas Parker, a charming but troubled local who'd once served as a rookie cop before being dismissed from the force for disciplinary issues. At first, Emily's family was wary, particularly protective Hannah, who sensed something volatile beneath Lucas's friendly surface. But Lucas, intent on proving himself, volunteered for errands, fixed leaky faucets, and showered the Millers with gifts. Gradually, Janice's guard relaxed, grateful for the help and the sense of safety a man's presence seemed to bring. Yet beneath this veneer, tension simmered. Lucas's possessiveness over Emily grew, and soon his visits grew unpredictable. A knock in the late hours, tense silences during dinner, arguments that spilled from whispered quarrels to shouted exchanges. Lucas resented how close the Miller women were, especially frustrated with Hannah, whose open distrust fueled his paranoia. One evening a disagreement turned aggressive. Lucas, enraged by a perceived slight, shoved Hannah during an argument, leaving her bruised and terrified. The Millers pressed charges with the NYPD, and though Lucas was forced to move out, the hold he had on Emily was not broken. She continued to meet him, craving connection and the hope that things could return to normal. This bitter cycle wore on for months. Janice grew increasingly anxious, haunted by the feeling that danger was never far from her doorstep. Neighbors began to note the ongoing chaos, tense encounters in the hallway, strange arguments echoing through thin walls, Emily's sudden mood changes. The apartment, once a haven, now felt like a trap. The final confrontation arrived one oppressive summer night in 1983. Lucas, drunk and agitated, forced his way into apartment 301. The shouting began within seconds, building to crashes and muffled screams. By the time neighbors intervened and police sirens pierced the chaos, it was already too late. Both sisters had been fatally wounded, their mother barely clinging to life after sustaining severe injuries. The aftermath devastated not only the Miller family but the spirit of Riverside Towers itself. Janice, despite surviving her physical wounds, was forever changed, her face a mask of grief as she quietly moved away, never caring to speak of the horrors endured inside those walls. Residents whispered about the tragedy, and apartment 301 would soon take on a life of its own, a symbol of heartbreak, a nexus for every unexplained chill and fleeting shadow. The tragedy became part of neighborhood folklore, the sorrow and violence echoing through the building long after the bodies were taken away. A complicated love. The tangled romance that blossomed within apartment 301 had an allure both captivating and deeply unsettling. Emily Miller had always been an independent spirit, keen on building a future for herself in the city. Yet when she first met Lucas Parker, a man with a gentle smile, quick wit, and an undercurrent of restlessness, she was swept up in a whirlwind of affection and curiosity. Lucas, recently fired from his rookie cop position, was drawn to Emily in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Their bond grew rapidly, fueled by nights of conversation over cheap takeout, and the shared illusion that their fractured pasts could be soothed by each other's company. At first, their romance carried a sense of fresh hope. Emily found solace in Lucas's protective nature, eager to have someone shield her from the ever-churning chaos of city life. Lucas, in turn, felt a fragile sense of belonging in the Miller household, a family that unconsciously filled the void his own fractured childhood had left behind. He would linger after dinner, fixing a leaking sink or changing a flickering light bulb, carving out a role for himself as both partner and protector. However, cracks soon began to appear beneath the surface. Lucas was prone to insecurity, especially when it came to Emily's closeness with her younger sister Hannah, or the warm rapport she shared with male colleagues from work. What started as offhand remarks or drawn-out silences steadily devolved into frequent accusations and icy standoffs. Emily's once lively demeanor became subdued, her friends noticing how she hesitated to answer calls or spent more time at home, missing social gatherings. Lucas began to impose subtle rules about whom she could meet or when she should return home, always justifying his concerns with proclamations of love and care. Despite the Miller family's initial skepticism, Emily's mother, Janice, gradually accepted Lucas due to his willingness to lend a hand during tough times. Emily herself was conflicted. She clung to the memories of their joyous early days, the long walks through Riverside Park, Lucas's tender apologies after every outburst, the sense of hope for stability. But as the cycle wore on, Emily grew weary of Lucas's jealous outbursts and the relentless emotional tug-of-war between them. Hannah, younger but fiercely protective, openly distrusted Lucas. She pressed her sister to rethink the relationship, warning Emily that affection should not be measured by suffering. This strained the sisters' bond, and tensions simmered beneath every family dinner. More than once, tearful whispers drifted through the apartment at night, pleas for things to go back to the way they were, for understanding and patience, even as the walls themselves seemed to close in around the fractured family. The tangled romance became the heart of the apartment's growing darkness, its echoes lingering long after doors were slammed and apologies faded into silence. Conflict erupts. As months passed in apartment 301, the atmosphere became charged with tension that grew too strong to ignore. Lucas, once cautious in showing his possessiveness, started escalating his control over Emily in subtle but ever-present ways. What had once been an occasional question about her whereabouts evolved into a constant monitoring of her phone, unannounced visits at her workplace, and icy stares whenever she laughed too freely or lingered too long in conversations with others. Emily felt increasingly suffocated and confused, torn between the fading warmth of their relationship and the invisible shackles tightening around her daily life. Hannah, ever attuned to her sister's moods, saw the signs before anyone else. She began leaving little notes for Emily. Reminders of love and support slipped under her door or left in her coat pocket, hoping to nudge Emily toward confiding in her. Most of these overtures were met with strained smiles or tense silence. The apartment's once open kitchen, filled with shared laughter and late-night snacks, turned into a battleground of whispered arguments and tearful standoffs. One afternoon, the tension erupted. Lucas arrived unannounced with flowers in hand, only to fly into a rage when he found Hannah and Emily absorbed in a private, seemingly light-hearted conversation. He accused them both of conspiring against him. The altercation spilled from the kitchen into the living room, voices rising as pent-up frustrations were unleashed. Janice tried to defuse the situation, but Lucas's anger surged beyond words. He slammed his fist into the wall, causing a picture frame to crash down, the glass shattering in a way that startled all three women into silence. That night, Emily locked her door for the first time. Her dreams were restless, dappled with anxious faces and the echo of her own scream. Meanwhile, Lucas spent hours pacing up and down the hallway on the third floor, muttering apologies and threats, sometimes stopping to press his ear against the door. Neighbors reported hearing him outside their unit, his voice strained and trembling. The arguments escalated in both frequency and intensity. Lucas's fits of jealousy turned physical, an angry shove here, a painful grip there. Hannah once intervened when she saw Lucas blocking Emily's path, her voice firm as she warned him to leave. The confrontation ended with Lucas hurling insults at both sisters and storming out, but not before vowing that things weren't over. Janice, after this, sat in the dim light of the living room long after her daughters had gone to bed, her hands clasped tightly, mind racing with worry over whether they needed to move, call the police again, or simply hope that Lucas would disappear from their lives as suddenly as he had arrived. The household could no longer maintain the illusion of normalcy. Doors remained locked, voices kept low, and every unexpected knock brought a new wave of dread. The apartment's very air changed, thicker, colder, alive with the charged energy of impending disaster. Residents in neighboring units noticed shadows flitting beneath the door, and the old creaks of the floorboards now sounded like urgent warnings in the night. The climax of tragedy. As the summer night pressed its heavy, humid silence upon Riverside Towers, a storm of violence brewed behind the locked door of apartment 301. For days leading up to that fateful night, tension buzzed like a live wire. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices, the sound of objects shattering and the occasional chilling weep drifting out into the hallway. Yet no one intervened. In the city that never sleeps, privacy and indifference sometimes shield tragedies too well. On the night it happened, the air was impossibly thick, almost electric, as if the building itself sensed the horror to come. Lucas arrived at the door of 301 in a haze of anger and desperation, his footsteps echoing as he pounded furiously. Inside, Janice and her daughters recoiled, hearts racing. Hannah called 911 with trembling fingers, barely managing to whisper for help. Emily tried to reason with Lucas through the locked door, her voice cracked and raw with fear, but he would not be dissuaded. The final barrier faltered as he broke through, bursting into the apartment with a kitchen knife gripped in white-knuckled hands. What followed was a blur of chaos and terror, words twisted into screams. The apartment, once a sanctuary, became an arena of frantic movement and shattered trust. Lucas's rage was unstoppable. Furniture splintered, photos crashed to the ground, and blood stained the faded carpet in moments that felt both infinite and unbearably brief. Emily tried to shield her mother and sister, but Lucas's anger, fed by months of brooding and perceived betrayal, could not be contained. Both sisters fought back bravely, but it was hopeless against his wrath. Next door, a neighbor heard the commotion, heart pounding, frozen with fear and uncertainty. She finally ran to alert the night doorman, who phoned the police again, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the receiver. The emergency call was dispatched, but the minutes stretched on endlessly as the horror inside apartment 301 reached its peak. By the time law enforcement burst through the battered door, the scene was a nightmare out of legend. Hannah and Emily lay lifeless, their arms entwined even in death. Janice, gravely wounded and half-conscious, was rushed to the hospital. Lucas, dazed and bloodied, stood with the knife trembling in his hand, his face a pale mask of grief, fury, and empty shock. He was apprehended without resistance, murmuring incoherently about betrayal, love gone wrong, and a longing to make things right. The news swept through Riverside Towers with the force of a hurricane. Yellow tape sealed off 301, and the hallways filled with whispered speculation, haunted silence, and the sullen sense that evil had visited their home. The tragedy marked the end of innocence for the once thriving community, cementing apartment 301's place in the annals of the city's darkest legends. Long-term consequences. The legacy of tragedy within apartment 301 spread far beyond the Miller household, casting a lingering pall over the Riverside Towers community for decades to come. The horror that transpired in those walls refused to remain sealed behind closed doors. It seeped into the routines, memories, and conversations of everyone who called the tower home. Word of the double homicide quickly traveled throughout the block, morphing from whispered disbelief to a kind of collective trauma. Children who once ran fearlessly along the hallways now clung anxiously to their parents whenever they passed the door, which for a time stood marred with yellow crime scene tape. Neighbors who had always exchanged polite nods or quick greetings suddenly avoided eye contact, burdened by the knowledge of a terrible violence that had unfolded so close to their own lives. The mailroom, elevators, and even the building's laundry facility became spaces reverberating with tension. The social fabric that once brought the residents together felt permanently torn. Many longtime tenants chose to move out over the following months, unsettled by the sense that apartment 301 had tainted the building's very atmosphere. Those who stayed adopted odd rituals. Some muttered silent prayers before taking the stairs past the third floor, while others hung protective charms above their doorways or left offerings just beyond the taped-off threshold. Superstitions thrived. Every unexplained draft, flickering light, or echoing footstep became potential evidence that the shadow of violence had never truly lifted. The tragedy wove itself into the folklore of the entire neighborhood. Manhattan locals, from shopkeepers to late-night cab drivers, traded tales of the haunted floor where sorrows ran so deep they could be sensed in the air. Prospective buyers steered clear of units near the third-floor corner, no matter how enticing the deals presented by desperate real estate agents. Property values in Riverside Towers fell, and the new superintendents fielded constant questions about the infamous apartment. As time marched forward, the stories underwent further transformations, layered with new rumors, embellished details, and a growing sense that the tragedy had stained more than just the apartment itself. Some claimed to hear faint melodies or whispered arguments when they passed the sealed door at night. Others said they saw shadowy figures gazing out from the third-floor window, even when the apartment was officially uninhabitable. The building management eventually gave in to pressure from both city officials and frightened residents, and had apartment 301 bricked up, using heavy cement to erase the entrance as if hoping to contain the darkness within. Yet the emotional fallout could not be so easily walled off. For years to come, the surviving Miller mother, Janice, was known to visit the sidewalk across from Riverside Towers, standing silently for hours, as if searching for closure she would never receive. Families who remained long after the event recounted restless nights filled with inexplicable chills, recurring nightmares, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. Some sought spiritual counsel, organizing prayer circles or inviting clergy to bless the building, but peace was fleeting at best. What was once thought of as an ordinary urban complex had become ground zero for regret and superstition. Over time, the tale of apartment 301, its senseless loss and its mysterious aftermath, became a somber, cautionary legend recited on stormy nights. Even as new generations took up residence and most signs of the tragedy faded from view, something in the foundation of Riverside Towers seemed irreparably changed, a quiet reminder that pain, fear, and memory can root themselves deeper than any wall. Close the door. After the tragedy of apartment 301, the city authorities decided that the only solution was to permanently seal off the infamous unit. Early one morning, under the watchful eyes of building security and a gathering of unnerved residents, a crew arrived with wheelbarrows of bricks, bags of cement, and heavy-duty tools. The hallway was cordoned off with yellow caution tape, while maintenance staff carefully emptied the space of anything that might still hold evidence or memory of what had unfolded inside. Tenants who ventured close could feel the chill of solemnity thick in the air as the workers methodically constructed a new barrier where a door had once been. Every blow of the hammer, every scrape of cement seemed to echo down the corridor, punctuating not just the end of an era, but the erasure of an open wound from the heart of Riverside Towers. When the last brick was mortared in place, and the number 301 inches was discreetly removed, a strange silence settled on the entire floor. It was as if the building itself paused to breathe. The newly bricked wall blended awkwardly with the faded paint of the third-floor hallway, an angular patch atop old scars, the passing years unable to weather its difference. Management, eager to dispel the whispers and superstitions that clung to 301, placed a plain, potted plant in front of the bricks, as though obscuring the scar might hasten collective forgetting. However, the effect was the exact opposite. Residents walking past the sealed space found themselves slowing, stealing glances at the uneven brickwork, or brushing their fingers over the stubborn groove in the floor where countless keys had once scraped. New tenants were given a rehearsed explanation. "This was once a utility closet," the super would say, voice tinged with weariness, eyes darting briefly to the wall. But everyone who'd lived in Riverside Towers long enough knew the truth, or some version of it. The bricked-up entry became the centerpiece of rumor, story, and anxious speculation. Some long-tenured residents claimed that, late at night, you could still hear faint sounds from behind the sealed wall. The muffled trickle of running water, the click of a turning lock, even soft, indistinct voices in the language of the lost. Teenagers dared each other to place their palms against the bricks during sleepovers, then swore their hands felt a cold pulse, or a slight vibration like the rhythm of a ghostly heartbeat. The most superstitious carried out makeshift rituals, tucking tiny tokens of protection at the baseboard, or burning incense when they had to pass by after sunset. Maintenance staff told stories in hushed voices about light bulbs burning out twice as quickly near the old apartment, their tools going missing never to be found, or finding dust on the exact spot where the tragedy had occurred no matter how often the hallway was cleaned. The sense of forbidden territory gave apartment 301 a mythic stature. Parents wove bedtime warnings about obedience and respect for boundaries, alluding vaguely to the haunted wall at the end of the hall. Local ghost hunters found their way to Riverside Towers, snapping photographs, and occasionally offering to spend a night in the corridor in hopes of recording unexplained phenomena. They rarely left with anything but ghostly stories, yet each tale, no matter how slight, seemed to add another brick to the mythology. Perhaps most unsettlingly, there were persistent accounts of odd occurrences that defied rational explanation. Building staff sometimes reported the elevator pausing briefly on the third floor with no call button pressed, or pets growling and refusing to pass the sealed entrance. A handful of tenants even left anonymous notes with building management, describing the feeling of being watched as they hurried by or seeing fleeting movements in their peripheral vision, a flash of red hair, a shadow darting just where the door should have been. Over time, what was intended as an act of closure became a focal point for the building's lingering pain and memory. The brick wall stood not only as a physical barrier separating past from present, but as a collective monument to grief, an uneasy reminder that some stories cannot be buried beneath stone and mortar. Late at night, when all the other apartments glowed softly with screens and lamps and the only sound was the hum of distant traffic, the silence around the sealed space felt heavier, as if the universe paused in memory of what had transpired behind the vanished door of apartment 301. Legendary Shadow Mansion. Long after the grim events in apartment 301 faded from newspaper headlines, the story took root in the collective memory of Riverside Towers and began weaving itself into the very atmosphere of the building. The events that occurred behind those now bricked walls gradually transformed from mere tragedy into urban legend, a shadow that stretched across decades and generations, refusing to let go of its hold on the community. Children who grew up in the building inherited stories whispered to them by elders, hushed warnings, cautionary tales, and eerie bedtime reminders that blended truth and fancy, until no one could tell them apart anymore. Parents, too exhausted or unnerved to recount the brutal facts, rerouted their unease into myth-making, tales of restless spirits, rooms that remained icy cold no matter how high the radiator was turned, and glimpses of red-haired girls silhouetted against third-floor windows in the dark hours before dawn. As years passed, the veracity of the legend mattered less than its purpose. to explain the uneasiness that lingered long after police packed away their yellow tape. Schoolchildren dared each other to touch the bricked-over doorway when passing by, swearing they felt icy pulses of breath or heard faint, plaintive singing echoing from behind the wall. Stories abounded among babysitters, delivery drivers, and even taxi drivers. They spoke of dogs refusing to walk past the third-floor corridor, of light bulbs that shattered inexplicably in hallways, and of flowers that withered overnight when placed outside apartment 301's old entrance. Newly arrived tenants could sense the shift in mood upon their first mention of the infamous door. Neighbors would exchange loaded glances or avoid the topic entirely, offering brisk nods and swift subject changes. As time forged ahead, local artists and musicians began drawing inspiration from the legend. The tragedy spawned poems, songs, and paintings across the city, each work trying to make sense of what was left behind, as if by creating art, the restless memories could finally be quieted. Ghost hunters and paranormal journalists flocked to Riverside Towers hoping to catch a whisper of the supernatural, with every blurry photograph or audio recording serving only to add more fuel to the mythos. The legend grew larger than life, seeping into online forums, documentaries, and even t-shirts emblazoned with cryptic slogans like, "Don't look at 301. Decades on, the shroud draped across apartment 301 served both as a warning and a badge of honor for veterans of the building. Surviving residents gained a certain notoriety in the wider New York community. Cab drivers would swap Riverside stories on late-night rides while bartenders regaled patrons with tales of doomed love and ghostly sightings. The legacy of the tragedy became a shared language, an unspoken understanding among those who spent any meaningful amount of time in the shadows of the Riverside Towers. Apartment 301, now invisible behind a patchwork wall, had become a legend that refused to die. Even as dust gathered and fresh paint covered old scars, the sense of something unresolved lingered, a weight pressing on the hearts of residents and visitors alike. The legend was no longer about the facts of the case or the identity of the people involved. It became a symbol of the building's resilience, the community's enduring fear, and New York City's peculiar talent for weaving history and rumor into something darkly magical that would outlast everyone who had ever set foot inside its haunted halls. What is the end? In the end, as time marched forward and decades blurred the sharp edges of memory, one fundamental question lingered in the hearts of those still haunted by the events of apartment 301. What remains after such an ordeal? Behind all the stories, superstitions, and countless whispered conjectures, the true legacy of Riverside Towers, and in particular that fateful apartment, manifested not only in the echoes of unexplained phenomena or shadowy figures glimpsed at the edge of vision. It lived in the sorrow-hardened hearts of the survivors, in the permanent unease of the neighborhood, and in the way the tragedy constantly reshaped the community's sense of itself. Some people firmly believed that the souls of Emily and Hannah were never able to rest, forever tied to the place where they encountered their untimely deaths. Occasionally, locals claimed to feel a chill in the air as they passed the bricked-up entrance, or to hear distant music and subdued voices that faded with the dawn. These perceived hauntings, whether truly supernatural or artifacts of collective trauma, gained new layers with every retelling. Meanwhile, Lucas remained imprisoned in both body and spirit, a living reminder of unspeakable guilt and the city's undercurrent of unresolved pain. The stain of his actions never quite washed away, despite years behind bars and the relentless march of new headlines overtaking old news. The apartment's tragic tale became a kind of touchstone for conversations around innocence lost, warnings about unchecked obsession, and the unpredictable violence that can erupt among ordinary people. Apartment 301's story became, at its core, a parable about grief and endurance, about the many forms heartbreak can take, and about the capacity of a city to remember and reinterpret its scars. While renovations faded old bloodstains and management rebranded the hallway, there was still a subtle pulse beneath the floorboards, a reminder that some wounds leave a permanent mark. Ultimately, for those who called Riverside Towers home or listened to the legend from afar, what truly remained was a heightened awareness of the thin line separating safety from disaster, hope from loss, and memory from myth. The story of apartment 301 endured, not as a single tragedy, but as 1,000 tiny echoes, each one coloring the lives of those who came after, making sure the shadows on the third floor never fully disappeared.